Hi, my name is Megan Sanchez, and I will be presenting on the topic of law versus faith. Is it really? In the book of Romans. Here are some of the key topics we will touch on in this presentation. The author of Romans is Paul. He states in Romans 1, verse 1, "This letter is from Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, chosen by God to be an apostle and sent out to preach his good news." So, the issue that Paul outlines here in Romans as our underlying cause and reason for the Torah and commandments is sin. He walks through several examples of people and circumstances that contributed to the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross. For example, there is a topic called federal headship. This is where Adam and Jesus are kind of contrasted. So, for instance, Adam sinned, and so therefore we have all sinned because his sin became the process of human mortality, which is not to be confused with spiritual life and death, but rather physical life and death. So, his sin and disobedience revealed the issue. However, Jesus, which is also the new Adam, was perfectly obedient in an act of sacrificial love, and he offered his life so that we now have the gift to have the relationship with God. Abraham is another great example. His faith was foundational for all believers. Spiritual life and death follow him. So there are the Jewish and the non Jewish, which would be the Gentiles. Chapter 1 outlines that all humanity is trapped in sin and selfishness because of idolatry and results in the distortion of humanity. Chapter 2, however, responds by the Jewish people saying that the Torah has helped them follow God, but Paul actually says they're just as broken and sinful as the Gentiles. So therefore, all of us are now trapped in sin and rebellion and selfishness. The law that they were referring to were the Torah and commandments. So the law is presented by Moses that it's a gracious gift from God to his people. It's not supposed to be something that's binding and restricting, but it keeps them different from their neighbors because it shows us how to love others, and to be in love with God. The Jewish people, however, began to misunderstand and twist this law, and then, therefore, the law became binding and restricting and removed us from grace by the time Jesus came. So they developed a highly involved works righteousness system. So, what was the point of giving Israel the law? It focused on the 613 commands given through Moses on Mount Sinai, not just the Torah, which would be the first five books of the Bible. While the commands of the Torah are good and show God's will for how Israel should live, they broke all the laws. In fact, the more laws that they were given, the more that they broke and replayed the cycle of Adam's sin and disobedience. So, therefore, the laws that were supposed to make them good actually made them more guilty. This paradox is the point. God's goal was to make it crystal clear that there is evil and sin that have taken over our hearts, and the law can't do anything about that. Sin is a reality that invades us, and universally, and God, through Christ, has addressed this issue of sin. So the answer is Jesus. It's his solution for all. God remains righteous and makes a way always. We can place our faith in Jesus and be freed from sin and condemnation. God rights believers because of Jesus' death, his resurrection, and his baptism. So while the commands focused in on the sin and exposed it on the people of Israel, Jesus is now the representative, and where Israel failed to keep the law, Jesus paid for that sin through his death and resurrections. In other words, Jesus' spirit is changing our hearts so that we can truly live out the core commands of the Torah to love God and our neighbor. God has taken action to deal with this problem of sin that Paul was talking about, and gave us a gift of Jesus Christ's death on the cross by his blood, which leads us to justification, which is where we, who are the sinners, we have the opportunity to have sin removed and righteousness given to us in its place through Jesus. It means to be declared righteous by God. The law revealed sin, right? But it did not make us righteous. This does not mean that the law is bad, but that it was never intended to be used as a means of self justification. So, where we are made righteous is as a gift by grace and generosity of God. It was God's original plan of promise versus Israel's specific law. We are now righted by faith and have peace with God. For example, Abraham believed, and so he was credited with righteousness. David confessed his sin, and he was credited with righteousness. So this brings us back to our question. Are we really pitting the law given to us by God against the faith it takes to be made righteous? The answer is no, and in fact, they work hand in hand. In Romans chapter 3, where Paul shares that the law supports faith way of God's righteousness, is just an intro to what he does throughout the rest of this book. He uses Abraham as an example in chapter 4, verses 1 through 25, and shows how Abraham was righted by faith, not by law, which would be circumcision. In fact, faith establishes law, and law supports faith. So, in theological terms, justification cannot be separated from righteous living, which shows up in the laws given to us. Law's goal is faith. Faith establishes law, and faith doesn't void law. Law can't void faith and promise. Law's function reveals failures, not reckons righteousness. The real heart of God's law is loving one another. So, despite the law, we can all come together on the same terms with God. God's purpose is a renewed creation where God's love gets the final beautiful word. So, the highest calling is to love. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself, which fulfills all of the commands. Looks like unity, peace, and community, and there's reconciliation and justification by faith through grace. Thank you.